Welcome to Inclusive Cyber, your front row seat to understand how a diverse mix of voices is not just necessary, but essential to protect our most sensitive computer networks and personal data. I'm your host, Danny Magallanes, and through my podcast, we shine the spotlight on the heroes and trailblazers from every corner of society who are redefining the diversity, equity, and inclusion frontier. Every episode is a step towards a cyber community that's as varied as it is united, where everyone has the keys to unlock their potential and the power to protect our digital world. Join us on this journey where every listen, every share, every dialogue inches us closer to this new reality. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Bertoni. She's a professor at Metro State University here in Denver in the Criminology and Cybersecurity department. We talk about her background and how she got into IT, which is just amazing. And we also talk about some very interesting topics like nonlinear dynamics, chaos theory, and much more. You definitely need to tune in to really understand what those are. Several traits that I really admired from Dr. Bertoni is having that radical curiosity and just simply asking questions. I appreciate everybody listening. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Enjoy the episode. Dr. Bertoni, welcome to Inclusive Cyber. Super excited to have you on the show. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
And really looking forward to diving into your background, your education. But before we do that, can you provide your background, just a quick snapshot for the audience?
I am currently teaching mostly cybersecurity courses in the criminology department at Metro. I have a bunch of independent research work that I'm doing, mostly about violent societies and the role of disinformation in helping to encourage them. I also work at the University of Colorado Medical School, helping to coach communication skills for people going into the health profession.
I know we're going to dive into each one. So the first one is kind of a macro question. I know you're a doctor. Describe your mindset on you getting your bachelor's, getting your master's, and you're just going to keep on going until the finish line.
As soon as I found out what a PhD was when I was like a toddler, I wanted one. I wanted to kind of go as far as I could. That flagged a little bit in high school. I wasn't a great student in high school, quite frankly. I think because I wasn't encouraged to think. So when I got to college, I had taken a year off between high school and college. I graduated a year early from high school, and I had already started kindergarten a year early, so I was 16 when I graduated from high school. In part because I had enough credits because I had taken another language instead of a study hall. But mostly they really wanted to get me out of there because I was a rabble-rouser. They were glad to be shut of me. And then I went on to college. My initial thought after being out of school for a year and trying to figure things out was, wow, this can't be my life. So I went back to school with a vengeance. Did very well in college and started out as a musical theater major. My thinking being, I have to go to college. What will I enjoy that will keep me out of the sun for 4 years? So that's where I started. And then in the beginning of my sophomore year, I had an 8:00 in the morning acting class with one of these guys that had like the black turtleneck sweaters and stuff. And I wanted to slap him and it was too early. And at the same time, I had like my third or fourth writing teacher who was suggesting, maybe you're in the wrong major. So I changed my major. I became a writing major. And I also got a BFA rather than a BA. That was interesting because when I was doing that, a lot of people are saying, oh, don't get a BFA, don't do that. You'll never get a job. And I can tell you that the number of people who have even commented on the fact that I have a BFA and not a BA, like nobody cares. Nobody cares. From there, I started getting really interested in religion and ideology and conflict and that kind of thing. I went to Harvard Divinity School with a research question for my master's. Is the reason that so many religions and symbols and everything are the same across cultures, is that because there is some kind of spiritual Sanskrit that everything disseminated from? Or is it because we all have the same brain? Let me save you some years and tens of thousands of dollars. Same brain. It's because we all have the same brain. While I was there, I discovered I was actually a lot more interested in the beginning of conflict than the end of it. I did all this conflict resolution work, and I split my degree between the Divinity School and the Kennedy School at Harvard. So religion and government, now it seems really prophetic, like that was a really good idea. But at the time, people were like, oh, politics and religion, you'll never be able to talk to anybody at cocktail parties. Which is cool with me. If I go to a cocktail party, I'm probably going to try to play with the pets. That's what I'm going to do. So, but I'm like a non-shy introvert. I usually like to just get other people talking about themselves, and I'm a pretty good listener. I wouldn't talk about my own stuff at a cocktail party anyway. Like, they'd have to really prod me into it.
Starting as, drama acting major and then transitioning to divinity and conflict resolution, complete 180, 360 several times. You just never know what life is going to throw at you, especially when we're first starting college. It's like, well, what do you want to be when I grow up? Well, I'll tell you when I get there. Or there might be that serendipitous moment, that professor, that class that really resonates with you. I definitely like that. But can you go into a little bit about the violent societies and your work there? Because the reason I want to kind of dip into that just a little bit is based on cybersecurity and more specifically cybercrime.
Okay. So one of the things that I did while I was at Harvard was I secretly began working on nonlinear dynamics. From conflict resolution, I got into dispute resolution systems design and game theory. And then I started working a lot on nonlinear dynamics, on chaos, complexity, that kind of thing. At the time, my professors did not want me messing with that stuff. They considered it a distraction. It was too fringy. It was too weird. And they want you to innovate if you're on the Harvard faculty. They don't want you to innovate if you're a student. From there, I started thinking about, okay, where can I go that I can write the dissertation that I want to write? That's how I ended up at the Korbel School at the University of Denver. They enticed me with promises of designing my own degree, which turned out to be like a farcical. That wasn't accurate at all. But I did get to more or less write the dissertation that I wanted to, which was about how societies, kind of stable societies, unravel into violence. And I used a method of nonlinear dynamics called orbital decomposition to trace the patterns of how that happens. Did a bunch of case study type things and ended up actually having to write a 2-pronged dissertation because the kinky math that I was working on was still weird enough that most of my committee didn't really understand what I was doing. So I wrote like a qualitative dissertation and then the quantitative piece that I had wanted to write all along, which had to be supervised by someone else outside the university. But fortunately, I had gone to enough conferences and stuff that I knew people who could do that for me. I'm very grateful that someone did. I ended up with a dissertation about violent societies and how they deteriorate based on the observations of a criminologist named Lonnie Athens, who did a bunch of work on what he called, it's how regular people become dangerous, violent criminals. Not people with chemical imbalances or serious psychosis or anything, just regular people becoming dangerous, violent criminals. And he identified a very specific pattern to that. What I wanted to do was see if that pattern could be applied to the societal level. And again, let me save you some time. Yes. That's what my dissertation was about. And then the nonlinear dynamical analysis of theory.
That's fascinating stuff. The majority of that is definitely over my head. But one question that popped up, my background is psychology. I guess where does background of the individual fit in, if at all? Meaning, if they had a very, let's just say, violent upbringing versus somebody who had a more stable upbringing, how do you factor that into the work that you're doing?
Well, that's part of it. It's a 4-stage process. It's got exit points and whatnot. For example, part of what made it interesting to me was in my own family. My maternal grandfather was a psycho. He was a horrible human being. And yet, his kids, none of them became violent despite years of varying kinds of abuse. And in fact, my mom's 2 brothers turned out to be great dads who were, I wouldn't say sensitive exactly, but like very whole men. And they both have daughters who adore them, and they're terrific parents. That's kind of interesting, right? If you're supposed to become what your parents are, why didn't that happen to people I know? The short answer is there are 4 basic stages of violentization. And the second stage is called belligerency, where you're deciding if this is who you're going to be. And a lot of people exit at that point. They say, no, I don't want any part of this. And they either get away or they find some sort of shelter for the time being and eventually make their way out of the situation. The third one is called violent performances, which is very much what it sounds like, testing out their new violent persona. And a lot of people exit there. They're kind of like, you know what? I don't like this. I don't like how I feel. Or I think this is too dangerous. I'm going to get killed if I go down this path. There are a lot of exit points. And there are a lot of points where people can say, no, I don't want to do this. And even once they've gotten to the end stage and become a dangerous, violent criminal, there are still cases of people who decided they didn't want that life anymore and came back from it. There are a lot of ways to escape.
For me, I really love this stuff because it's all about psychology and going back to nature versus nurture. So I just find that just fascinating stuff. But I think we could definitely go down a rabbit hole and dig a little bit deeper. But I'm going to pull back just a little bit. So in regards to, so before we get into cybercrime, so you did that. How did you make your way into IT and cybersecurity?
I made my way into cybersecurity specifically because I was teaching in the criminology department at Metro. I was teaching there. And then when the cybersecurity program started up, I already had a tech background before I went there. When they were looking around for people in the department who might be able to take on the mantle of cybersecurity, oh, I can do that. That's how I ended up there. And some other people in the department are not comfortable with that. And that's great for me because that's what I want to do. I feel like the department is very well-rounded. There's like a lot of practitioners in there. There are significantly fewer academics like me. I'm just like a straight up academic in that setting. I've done a lot of consulting work over the years. Most of it has been tech related. For example, I did a project a few years ago where the actual client was, and they were redesigning the way that some of their exams were going to be shown, that it was more of a storyboard. They were working on how to make that accessible. It's very visual, and they wanted to make it accessible so that even people who are visually impaired somehow, who wanted to pass this test, could still take it and still have a decent shot. I was working on that, helping them think about, oh, how can we do that? While I was doing that, it's a real pain in the butt to keep flipping back and forth between the exam thing that I'm looking at and what the answers are supposed to be while I'm testing the stuff. Yeah, I just took a weekend and learned enough Linux to be able to just do the test without having to keep looking stuff up. I was also the assistant project director for the emergency alert system when that was first becoming digitized in the mid to late 90s. I was working for a company that made that equipment, I did a lot of testing. I did a lot of talking to clients, and I did documentation and trying to make the product launch well. I also was the managing production editor of an online news organization for a while. That required a fair amount of technical skill, at least initially, to get everything set up. I kind of specialize in weird problems. I'm okay with walking into what feels like a disastrous situation to the people who are living it. It's not so bad for me because I'm on the outside of it and I'm being curious about the history and where they want to go and what's sticky and what doesn't seem to be working and what's making them anxious about the situation. Essentially, it's research, which is obviously a skill you have to have when you've been overeducated to the extent that I have. I would go in there and start looking around and talking to people and observing and asking questions and stuff. I have picked up a bunch of technical skills over time as needed. I made a career out of learning anything fast enough to not get fired. I'm really comfortable with uncertainty, in part because of my background in dynamical systems, but also because, I mentioned this to you when we were talking before, it's made me professionally fearless. I can just walk into any situation and it could be pure bedlam and like people are crying at their desks and the electricity's off or something. And I'm like, oh, alrighty. Here's where we are. Let's see what happened to make this happen. Makes me take a curious tack to crises, essentially. Stay curious, figure it out. Stuff presents itself pretty well if you're willing to be open and not particularly attached to a specific trajectory. That's often what causes crises.
Dr. Bertoni, I'm going to work backwards, but starting with what you initially said, professionally fearless. I love that term. I'm going to start using that. You might want to copyright that term because what it encompasses, I think you're not scared. You love another concept that you mentioned or two of them, having that curiosity, asking question, and I'm okay with uncertainty. I think I've met a lot of people throughout my career and life in general that the uncertainty just freaks them out, right? Or professionally fearless, just amazing. Backtracking a little bit to how you got in IT, would it be safe to say self-taught IT professional and just going in there, just asking those questions?
Yeah, pretty much. I started out doing technical writing here and there because I had the writing degree in the background. When you're writing documentation for something, the product's not finished. They give you what they've got, and some of it's code. I would be looking through it and be like, is this supposed to be like that? Because that doesn't seem like it should work. And they'd be like, oh, she debugs code. And then I'll charge them some more for doing other things than what I was initially supposed to be doing. I have a natural tester mindset. I like to break things, and I'm curious. If you can break it, you can figure out how it needs to be different to not break anymore.
Yeah, I love that mindset. It's almost like a hacker mindset, right? I know hacker in our day and culture is viewed negatively, but a hacker just wants to know how things work. Break it open and see whether it's something mechanical like a doorknob or something more digital like a computer or video game system or even your phone, how things work. So where did that passion, that curiosity come from? Was that something that you saw in family members, people around you, friends? Because again, that's a very rare quality. Where did that come from?
I was very much encouraged by my dad. He was a really extraordinary person. He had vast knowledge about everything. I was sort of de facto homeschooled. I was still going to school, but I literally learned everything I knew at home by asking my dad about stuff, or he'd help me figure things out. I had a really cool toy tractor when I was little that you could take apart and put back together, and it was like my favorite thing. I was always curious and theorizing and stuff. I didn't sleep until I was like 4 because I had a theory. I was, when I was old enough to be like a toddler, I observed that I was growing. I also had observed that if you got a bee sting, it swelled up. I thought that the way that you grew was to get stung by bees. And the radiator next to my bed made a buzzing noise. So I was like, that's where the bees are. And I'm not going to sleep. Because that's when they get you. They're not getting me when I'm awake. They're getting me when I'm asleep. Finally, my parents pried it out of me what the deal was. Let's investigate the radiator, shall we? Ultimately convinced me there were no bees in there. And then they explained how you actually grow.
You're a little mini scientist, right? You're already trying to deduce the environment that you were in. That seems logical, obviously, for a 2 or 3 year old, right? It's like, well, that's how we grow. Thank you for sharing that. I want to backtrack just a little bit in your nonlinear dynamics, your criminology, and cyber criminals. It seems that it might be very similar, that there's exit points, right? There's 4 different categories on where an individual goes the violent track. I don't know if you've done any research when it comes to cyber criminals, but it's really fascinating. And cyber criminals are global, but the biggest hotbed is in Eastern Europe. And one of the reasons why you have that hotbed there is you have individuals that have this education, whether self-taught or they went to school and there's no jobs. The economy is pretty bad there. So then that drives them to cyber criminal activity. But eventually they age out. Have you done any research on cyber criminals?
I do work about cyber criminals in a couple of different ways. I teach the graduate level theories of cybercrime course at Metro. Every spring, it's part of the curriculum for grad students to think about how criminological theories that they've already been exposed to probably might fit or not with cybercrime. I had to do a lot of thinking about that to put the course together, and they're grad students, so they prod and poke and challenge. That course evolves over time. My own work in violent societies, I've been focusing lately on misinformation and disinformation cause violence. One of the stages of violentization, the first stage is 3 things going on simultaneously. One of them is called violent coaching, which isn't quite what it sounds like. It's more the glorification of violence and goading someone in that direction. So that's very much what a lot of disinformation does. It plays a really strong role in a lot of the incitements that we've seen, like January 6th, for example. A lot of that happened on Twitter and by text. And people were acting on what they thought was accurate information, and it wasn't. It's actually pretty dangerous. I've been focusing on that a fair amount. It's a little bit different from what we think of as classic cyber criminals, because these were regular people engaging in criminal behavior because they thought they were doing something right.
It opens up another kind of avenue that we never really talked about. So just overall misinformation and where we're at now with technology, with generative artificial intelligence. One of my previous guests, we're talking about deepfakes. Right now with technology, they can repurpose my video, my voice now, because it's all online, and put me in a potentially compromising situation that, okay, Danny said this about maybe this group of people or about women, something that I never said, but now that information is out. But I guess the question to you, how do you combat misinformation?
Yeah. Okay, so there are a couple of issues. One of them is that there's no real authority anymore with the kind of democratization of information. Someone says something and people just take it for true, whether or not it is. Like when I was a kid, and I'm going to date myself again here, Walter Cronkite would come on at 6 o'clock And he would tell you what was going on, and then he would finish by saying, and that's the way it is. And it was. And if you ever were like, oh, so-and-so said that this was going on. No. Walter Cronkite reported something totally different. They're full of it. There's no real authority anywhere anymore. Yeah, you can look to established news organizations, but frankly, because of greed and looking at what sells, a lot of news organizations aren't as responsible about reporting as they used to be. They've got a 24-hour news cycle that they have to fill. Some of what they put on there is going to have to be fluff or speculation or something. And not everyone knows how to consume that critically because we don't teach that anymore. My high school civics class, again dating myself, had a component of media literacy, critical thinking, especially with regard to political advertising. And I think that's essential. I think we all need that. The other piece is it goes against certain values that we have as a culture, right? We want to say, oh, the internet is a free space and everyone's free to speak as they will. And if we try to censor what someone says, then it's a slippery slope. And then we all end up in a digital version of Fahrenheit 451. First of all, slippery slope, fallacy. Let's get that out of the way. But because of both there not being a clear authority and the fact that we don't want to limit what people can say, without changing something, there's nowhere to go. It's not going to get any better. What I think we should be doing is, okay, if we're using AI to construct crazy things and put them on the internet, why are we not using it to flag those things? There's often way too much stuff coming in for people to moderate, but it's not too much for a machine to moderate. So why aren't we using AI to better flag things that need to be more carefully considered?
Dr. Bertoni, I think those are excellent points, especially leveraging AI for the betterment of society, right? To eliminate or possibly reduce that misinformation. But I think you might have hit the nail on the head. It comes to greed. Companies are just pushing AI because I believe that it's a disruptor for the betterment of society. And of course, there's always going to be miscreants that kind of misuse the technology for financial gain, for fraud, and hurting people. But I still have optimism that companies and maybe even governments are going to have to regulate. They're going to have to step in and say, hey, we need to look at the ethical aspect of AI, the misinformation. But I think that authoritative figure, like you mentioned, that is the key, right? I know proponents against that would be, well, we don't want a big brother, right? But at the same time, we need to protect people. Right? It's going to be a challenge for sure. I want to shift topics because, again, we could talk for several hours on this, but just DEI in general, were there any challenges that you experienced when you were learning all the IT or any successes that you experienced?
Yeah, I kind of come from an unusual background because for several years I was raised by a single dad. And they were particularly formative years. My father was a terrific cook, and he knew how to sew, fix things. I learned a lot about how to fix stuff. I could make dinner and mend socks and rebuild a carburetor and sweat pipe. I never really thought of things as tasks as being gendered. My parents were very young and very progressive. I had to ask for Barbie, but like that toy tractor showed up unannounced. Like there's a lot of what happens if we don't say anything about gender roles? Does she notice? Nope. So for me, patriarchy was faceless and structural and has never been very personal. And also growing up with a male parent, there were things that were difficult about not having a female parent around during that time, but my dad did the best that he could. I was socialized to be a guy, so I didn't get a lot of the context that women in our culture tend to get. That made it difficult for me to have other women friends until I was like maybe 30. I didn't have a lot of female friends, but I had tons of guy friends. And that's the social situation I was most comfortable in for a long time. I was a bike mechanic while I was writing my dissertation. But you get thrown into a shop with a bunch of guys, and they're like, "Oh, there's a girl here. I guess we can't do this thing or say that or do this other thing." And then they'd get to know me a little bit, and they'd be like, "Oh, okay, this is fine. I can make a pretty good range of people comfortable around me." At the same time, that kind of opens the door for me to bring in other perspectives too. They're kind of like, she's not so bad. It's kind of one of the guys. You can say, "Oh yeah, and by the way, this guy over here that you haven't been talking to had something interesting to say." It gives me a little bit of a balance, but that gives me a spot in a doorway. I can be between spaces and cross-introduce things and whatnot.
Your experience and bringing in those diverse perspectives and experiences is what we need, not only in IT and cybersecurity, but just the world in general. So to kind of wrap things up here, Dr. Bertoni, what would be some of the key takeaways that you would want the audience?
In terms of cybersecurity and kind of industry in general, I think a lot of things, not just the media, corporations, or the political system, spend too much time trying to maximize profit at the expense of real innovation. Maybe it's cheaper to lay everybody off and have 5 people do all the work, but it sucks and it's not sustainable. I don't know. I'm just going to say it. Crusty old white guys like to do when they're running whatever. A lot of them are just, well, this is the way that we've always done it, and so this is the way that we're going to do it. Well, the way that we've always done it is running the world into the ground. And I would like to say, sit down, crusty white guys. Let's let someone else with actual fresh ideas and actual innovation plan try some stuff. Just sit back, smoke your cigar, chill out. Let us just try some stuff here and see if we can improve the situation.
At the end of the day, it's about taking care of one another. And yes, I know companies are here for profit. I understand that. But then taking care of your people, because if you don't, like you said, not only will you not innovate, but you won't have a mission either. And you won't have a company. So definitely love that perspective. And in closing, I always ask my guests, what book are you currently reading or have you recently read that you want to share with everyone?
Just one book?
If you have multiple, I'll take them.
All right. I have been reading The Culture Map by Aaron Meyer. And this is about all kinds of different cross-cultural styles of communication and doing business and ideas and how people work. I'm reading that because I am helping Samantha Carlin, who heads the Women's Leadership Challenge, among other things, to create a course about things like that. Not just that one source, but I've been imbibing a lot of cross-cultural communication kind of books to help with the course. And then more for fun, I like to read math books and chaos books and science books and things. This is a nonlinear dynamics book that has a lot of good illustrations. I've also been reading Metamagical Themas that I thought was here, but I don't see it. Douglas Hofstadter. It's a bunch of, I don't know, science-y brain toys, I guess. Mostly articles.
Those are 3 new books that I have to add to my library, which is, I think, behind me here. You could see part of it. Other books are all on the floor that are not on camera. But Dr. Bertoni, I appreciate all the insight from the books, from your background, sharing your story and how you got into cybersecurity. I really appreciate it, and would love to have you back on the show.
I'd love that.
Awesome. Thanks for being an inclusive cyber. Have a good one.
Thanks, you too, and thanks again for having me.